Have you ever noticed how most of us walk through life as if we're chasing something invisible? From the moment we wake up, our minds race ahead of our bodies, rushing toward deadlines, obligations, and worries about things that haven't even happened yet. Our steps quicken, our hearts pound, and somewhere along the way, we forget how to simply be. We've become so used to this constant forward momentum that stillness feels unfamiliar. We're either running from the past or reaching for a future that always seems just a little out of reach. And in doing so, we miss the only moment that truly belongs to us, this one. Now imagine if there was a way to rediscover the sacredness of the present, not by sitting on a cushion in a distant monastery, but in the simple, ordinary act of walking. Yes, walking. The one thing every human being does without a second thought. For thousands of years, long before smartphones and highways, before crowded schedules and endless notifications, walking was a natural meditation, a way to harmonize the breath, the body, and the mind, a ritual of presence. In ancient Buddhist traditions, monks and nuns didn't just practice mindfulness while seated in silence. They carried it into every step they took. Each footfall was a prayer, a vow, a conscious return to the here and now. They called it walking meditation. It's a practice that invites you to reclaim your steps, to feel the earth beneath your feet, to notice the subtle shifting of your weight, to breathe in sync with your movements, and to become fully awake to the miracle of simply being alive. As Zen master Thich, NH letter 1EA5T, H letter 1EA1NH, so beautifully said, the miracle is not to walk on water, but to walk on the earth. To truly walk, not merely move from one place to another, but to savor each step as if it were your first and your last. And yet, somewhere in the frenzy of modern life, this ancient art has been forgotten. We've reduced walking to a functional activity, a means to an end. We rush to catch the train, hurry to appointments, pace anxiously while waiting for good news, or walk mindlessly while scrolling through screens. The sacred rhythm of our steps drowned out by the noise of our thoughts. But what if we could change that? What if, in the very act of walking, we could find refuge, a moving sanctuary in the middle of the world's chaos? A way to come home to ourselves without having to escape to distant mountains or remote forests. The truth is, every step holds the potential to awaken something ancient within us. A wisdom that knows how to be fully alive, fully present, and fully at peace. It's not about adding one more thing to your already crowded to-do list. It's about transforming something you already do, walking, into a powerful tool for healing, clarity, and freedom. And you don't need fancy robes, incense, or sacred chants. You don't even need silence. All you need is a willingness to slow down, to notice, to listen to the gentle conversation between your feet and the earth. Because here's a secret most of us have forgotten. You're not walking on solid ground. You're walking on sacred ground. Every step is a dialogue with life itself. A reminder that the ground you tread was here long before you arrived and will remain long after you're gone. And in those quiet moments between steps, you might just hear something you've been missing, the steady, tender voice of your own soul. This isn't about religion. It isn't about following a strict set of rules or renouncing the world. It's about learning how to carry a temple within you, to turn sidewalks, trails, hallways, and even busy city streets into a path of mindfulness. Because the true pilgrimage is not a journey to a distant place, but a journey back to the present moment, to this breath, to this step. And that, my friend, is where this story begins, in the forgotten art of mindful steps, in the quiet revolution of choosing to be fully here, one breath, one step at a time. There's something strangely beautiful about the simplest things we overlook. A ray of morning light cutting through the branches, the way dew clings to a blade of grass, the steady rhythm of your own footsteps echoing softly against the earth. You see, we've been conditioned to think that meditation is something that happens only when the world is silent, when our eyes are closed, and our bodies are still. But long before meditation apps and retreat centers, there was a deeper, older wisdom, a knowing that mindfulness can live in motion. Walking meditation is exactly that. A practice of moving through the world not with haste, but with presence. It's the art of being fully aware while your body moves, turning every step into a conscious, living prayer. And here's the truth most people miss. You don't have to sit still to find stillness. In Buddhist tradition, particularly within Zen and the Theravada lineages, walking meditation holds a sacred place. It isn't a warm-up for seated meditation, nor a way to stretch your legs between sessions. It's a meditation in its own right, one that reveals the subtle miracle of simply being here. At its heart, walking meditation invites you to merge your awareness with the natural act of walking. Not to control it, not to perfect it, but to notice it. To be awake to the sensation of your feet touching the ground, the way your weight shifts, the gentle rise and fall of your breath. Every movement, no matter how small, becomes part of the meditation. The lifting of the foot, the moving forward, the placing of the foot back on the earth. Each action done with mindful attention. In this practice, there's no destination, no rush to arrive, because you realize the miracle isn't at the end of the path. It's in each step along the way. In the ancient texts, it's said that mindful walking cultivates sati, awareness, and samadhi, concentration. And not in some abstract philosophical sense, in a very real, tangible way. You begin to notice the sound of leaves beneath your feet, the texture of the ground, the shift in temperature as you move from sunlight to shade. And in those tiny observations, something profound begins to happen. The storm of thoughts in your head starts to settle. The world, once a blur, comes into focus. And for perhaps the first time in a long time, you begin to feel yourself alive inside your own body. What makes walking meditation so powerful isn't its complexity. It's the exact opposite. It strips away the unnecessary. It reminds you that awareness isn't found in distant, exotic places, but right here, in the ordinary miracle of walking. There are many ways to practice it. Some traditions walk slowly as if each step were a poem. Others find mindfulness in brisk, natural walking through a forest or along a shore. The method is secondary to the mindset. What matters is this. Are you paying attention? Are you truly here for this step? And this one? And this one? Because each step is an opportunity to break the cycle of unconscious living, to leave behind the trance of autopilot, to step not just across the earth, but back into your life. It's a ritual that turns sidewalks into sacred ground, corridors into cathedrals, everyday journeys into spiritual pilgrimages. And as you move with awareness, you begin to see that it was never about walking itself. It was always about awakening, about dissolving the barrier between body and mind, between breath and earth, between you and this astonishing, fleeting world. This is the heart of walking meditation, not a technique to master, but a way of being to remember. A gentle rebellion against a world obsessed with speed and distraction. A quiet act of reclaiming your presence, one mindful step at a time. And once you taste that stillness in motion, you'll realize you've been carrying peace within you all along. It's time to remember how to walk again. So now you know what walking meditation truly is. Not a mystical ritual, not a performance, but a return to the wisdom of your own body, to the miracle of each step. And maybe, just maybe, you're wondering, how do I actually do this? The beauty is it's simpler than you think. But like all truly simple things, its power lies in your sincerity, not in its complexity. Let's begin here. Find a space. It doesn't need to be a monastery garden or an ancient forest. It could be a quiet corridor in your home, a path along a park, even a patch of earth beneath a tree. What matters isn't where you walk, it's how you walk. Stand still for a moment. Feel the ground beneath your feet. Notice how it holds you without question, without condition. Let your awareness sink down from the restless mind into the soles of your feet. Take a breath, not to change it, not to deepen it, but just to feel it. The rise, the fall, the presence of life moving through you, and then begin. Lift your right foot. Notice the precise instant your foot leaves the earth. Feel the muscles engage, the shifting of your weight. Move your foot forward, stay with that simple motion, noticing how it travels through space, how your balance adjusts. Place your foot down. Feel the contact, heel, ball, toes. Notice the texture beneath you. Is it soft, rough, cool, warm? And then do the same with the other foot, step by step, not walking for distance, not walking to arrive, but walking to be present. Let your arms hang naturally, or place them gently in front of you, whatever feels unforced. Let your gaze settle a few feet ahead, not staring, not analyzing, just resting your attention. And as you move, you might notice your mind trying to pull you away. Thoughts about yesterday, plans for tomorrow, stories, judgments, worries. It's okay. That's what minds do. But here's the practice. When you notice you've drifted, come back to your feet. Come back to the step you're in, not with frustration, not with judgment, but with gentle curiosity. Like greeting an old friend you'd forgotten was right beside you. And in this simple, deliberate motion, lifting, moving, placing, you start to untangle the tight knots inside you. If emotions arise, let them. Feel them in your chest, in your stomach, in your throat, and keep walking. Each step is an invitation to carry both peace and pain with tenderness. Some traditions pair each step with a phrase, words whispered silently in the heart. I have arrived. I am home. Or simply, here, now. If that speaks to you, use it. If not, let silence be your mantra. The rhythm is yours to choose. You can walk slowly, savoring each moment like a fine note in a song. Or you can walk at a natural pace, letting awareness rise and fall with the steps. What matters is that you're here for it, not lost in thought, not chasing a destination, just fully alive in this ordinary miracle. And remember, it's not about perfection. Your mind will wander, your pace might falter. That's part of the practice. Each time you return, you strengthen your presence. You reclaim a little more of yourself from the noise of the world. And soon you'll find something shifts. The weight you didn't know you were carrying begins to lift. The world softens, your heart slows, and the earth feels a little more like home beneath your feet. That's how walking meditation works. Not through force, but through quiet, steady remembering. A step, a breath, a life lived fully awake. And the beauty is, you don't need a special time, a special robe, or a mountain retreat to practice this. You can do it between meetings, on your way to the grocery store, in your backyard beneath the night sky. Everywhere you walk, you carry this ancient art with you. And in those quiet moments of awareness, you'll begin to notice something beautiful. Life was never meant to be a race. It was always meant to be a walk. You'd think walking would be the easiest thing in the world. A simple act we've done since childhood, step after step, moving from here to there. But the truth is, in mindful walking, the real journey doesn't happen around you. It happens within. When you start this practice, you might notice it right away. The way your mind clings to stories, the way thoughts appear uninvited and insistent. A single step, and suddenly you remember a conversation from last week. Another step, and you're worrying about an email you forgot to send. 100 steps, and you realize you've been lost in an argument that never happened. It's astonishing, really, how rarely we're actually where our bodies are. And this is where the inner journey begins. Walking meditation isn't about clearing your mind. That's a myth. It's about seeing it clearly. When you slow down and let awareness settle into your feet, your breath, your movement, you start to notice what's always been there. The constant stream of thoughts, the rising and falling of emotions, the subtle tensions in your chest, the tightness in your throat. It's like shining a light into a room you've ignored for years, and at first it can feel messy, uncomfortable. But that's where healing lives. Each step becomes a mirror, reflecting back your habits, your fears, your longings. And instead of running from them, you walk with them. You'll find anger surface without warning. You'll hear the voice of your inner critic whispering doubts. You might even feel grief rise like a tide you thought you'd outrun years ago. And here's the practice. You don't chase them away. You don't drown in them. You simply notice. You allow them to be. You take a step and you breathe. Another step and you name what's here. Thinking. worrying, remembering, feeling tightness, just naming, without drama, without attachment, and something beautiful happens. The things you feared would swallow you whole begin to loosen their grip. Emotions, you realize, are like clouds. They form, they drift, and they dissolve. Thoughts are like birds passing through an open sky. No matter how stormy the mind, awareness remains vast and untouched. In those moments, you remember your true nature, not the restless voice inside your head, not the fleeting emotions in your chest, but the quiet witness behind it all. That's where walking meditation leads you, into the landscape of your own mind, to discover that you are not your anger, not your fear, not even your joy. You are the one who sees. And as you keep walking, something even subtler begins to unfold. The body starts to speak. You notice how tightly you've been holding your shoulders, how you rush your steps when a difficult thought arrives, how your jaw clenches at memories you'd rather forget. And in this awareness, healing begins. You soften your shoulders, you slow your steps, you breathe a little deeper. The path outside reflects the path within. Each step is a choice, to rush or to rest, to resist or to allow, to forget or to remember. And as this practice deepens, the walk becomes a kind of pilgrimage, not to a holy mountain or sacred shrine, but to the most sacred place of all, your own heart, a place we spend our lives running from, yet one that welcomes us the moment we return. And in those simple, steady steps, one foot after another, you begin to remember something ancient, a truth the Buddha himself taught beneath the Bodhi tree. That peace is not found by escaping life's difficulties, but by meeting them one mindful step at a time. And so you walk, not to get somewhere, not to become someone, but to come home to what you already are, a traveler, a witness, a presence vast as the sky. And as your feet meet the earth, you realize the greatest journey you'll ever make is not across oceans, not through forests or cities, but the quiet, fearless return to yourself. Some journeys change your scenery, others change your soul, and walking meditation belongs to the latter, because as those simple, mindful steps accumulate, something begins to shift quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. But then one morning you notice it. You wake with a lighter heart, your breath feels softer, the world doesn't tug at you quite as hard, and you realize this practice, it's working. But how? What exactly is it doing beneath the surface of those ordinary steps? The most immediate and perhaps the most precious benefit is a return to presence. In a world obsessed with outcomes, future plans, and past regrets, walking meditation teaches you the forgotten art of being where you are. Not where you should be, not where you wish you were, but here, right now. It sounds simple, but make no mistake, this is a revolution. Because when you anchor your awareness into your body, into each step, you pull yourself out of the storm of endless thinking. You discover a kind of calm that isn't dependent on circumstances, a peace that lives beneath the noise. And as presence deepens, so does clarity. You begin to see your patterns, not as flaws to fix, but as tender places needing your attention. You recognize the loop of anxious thoughts before they spiral. You feel the tension rising before it overtakes you. And in that space of awareness, you gain the power to choose, to pause, to breathe, to soften. This is how transformation happens. Not in grand, dramatic moments, but in the quiet space between a thought and a step. And then there's the healing of the nervous system. You see, our bodies carry stories. Decades of stress, trauma, unspoken grief, stored in muscles, breath, posture. Mindful walking invites those stories to surface, not to relive them, but to release them. The gentle, rhythmic motion soothes the fight or flight response. It lowers cortisol levels. It signals safety to a body that's spent too long on high alert. One step after another, and the body remembers what it feels like to be at ease. Not numb, not detached, but fully alive, fully grounded, fully here. This practice, though ancient, addresses a modern epidemic, the disconnection between mind and body. We live so much of our lives in our heads, lost in thought, disconnected from sensation. Walking meditation stitches that severed thread back together. It reclaims the body as a place of wisdom, a site of presence, a home. And from there, compassion naturally arises, not the distant, abstract kind, but a raw, tender recognition of your own humanness, of the quiet ache behind your busyness, of the silent grief beneath your anger, of the longing for peace beneath your distractions. And as you touch those places in yourself, you find you can no longer judge them in others. You notice the hurried steps of a stranger and see your own rushing reflected there. You witness the scowl of a passerby and remember your own days of heaviness. You watch the fidgeting of a restless child and recognize your own unquiet heart. This is no small thing, because the world doesn't need more perfect people. It needs more present ones, people rooted in their bodies, aware of their hearts, gentle with their flaws, and brave enough to meet life as it is. And perhaps the most beautiful gift of walking meditation is that it makes this transformation feel ordinary. No mountain retreats required, no dramatic breakthroughs demanded. Just you, your breath, your body, and the ground beneath your feet. And over time, the line between practice and life begins to blur. The mindfulness you cultivate in walking spills into how you listen, how you speak, how you hold space for joy and sorrow alike. You find yourself pausing before reacting, savoring small moments, meeting difficult days with a little more grace. And one day you realize you're no longer walking to escape your life. You're walking to fully enter it. And this is the gift you never saw coming, not just peace in the moment, but a life that feels whole, honest, and awake. A life where each step, however small, becomes an act of sacred defiance against numbness. A quiet yes to being here, fully, tenderly, unapologetically alive. And as this inner transformation unfolds, you'll begin to notice the world you once thought ordinary begins to shimmer, not because it changed, but because you did. The real beauty of walking meditation isn't in the rare, peaceful moments on quiet forest trails. It's in what it teaches you about how to move through the world, when the world won't slow down. Because let's be honest, most of us don't live in monasteries. We wake to alarm clocks, deadlines, crying children, city traffic, endless to-do lists. And yet, this is where the practice matters most. Mindful steps aren't meant to be confined to meditation halls. They belong in grocery store aisles, crowded sidewalks, office hallways, and morning commutes. And the truth is, you don't need silence to be mindful. You don't need perfect conditions. You don't even need extra time. You just need to remember. Remember that the ground is always beneath you, that your breath is always with you. That presence is always an option. It begins with the simplest act, pausing, at a stoplight, before opening a door, waiting in line, right in the middle of your busiest day. Just pause, feel your feet touch the earth. Notice the rise and fall of your breath. Sense the contact between your body and the moment. It only takes a few seconds, but those seconds are revolutionary, because every time you choose awareness over autopilot, you reclaim a piece of your life. You rewire your nervous system for calm. You train your mind to notice life as it unfolds, instead of missing it while chasing something else. Then, you start to weave walking meditation into the ordinary. When you walk to your car instead of scrolling through your phone, feel your steps. When you head to a meeting, let your breath anchor you. When you pace the room waiting for a phone call, notice the shift of weight in your feet, the texture of the floor beneath you. Slowly, without forcing it, your everyday movements become a kind of moving prayer, a practice of presence, a way to meet life where it actually happens, in the body, in motion, in the now. And it's in these ordinary, overlooked spaces that some of the deepest moments of awakening occur. Not in temples, not during perfect sunsets, but while walking to the mailbox, while taking out the trash, while carrying groceries through a parking lot. Because when you stop waiting for ideal conditions, you realize this is your life, and it's happening now. And once you taste what it's like to truly be present, even for a moment, you'll want more of it. So you begin to create small rituals, a mindful walk before breakfast, A few steady breaths before stepping into a meeting, pausing to feel the breeze as you cross the street. Tiny acts of remembrance. And what starts as practice becomes a way of being, a way of carrying yourself through the chaos without being consumed by it, a way of honoring your humanity in a world that rarely invites it. And over time, you'll notice, the world doesn't change, but your relationship to it does. You'll still have bad days, still lose your temper, still get overwhelmed, but you'll come back faster. You'll remember to soften, to feel the ground, to take a conscious breath. And in that moment, you'll reclaim yourself, because that's the heart of this practice. It's not about being calm all the time. It's about remembering that peace is always one step away, that no matter how far you wander, you can return to yourself in a single breath, a single step, a single moment of presence. And when enough of those moments gather, something beautiful happens. Your life begins to feel less like a race and more like a sacred walk, a journey you don't have to rush through, a path you don't have to perfect, but a landscape to be noticed, to be touched, to be fully lived. And it's there, in the ordinary streets and crowded rooms of your everyday life, that you'll discover the quiet, unshakable peace you've been searching for, not in escaping the world, but in learning how to walk through it awake. As our mindful journey comes full circle, there's a simple truth to hold close. The path isn't somewhere out there waiting to be found. The path is your every step, your breath, your heartbeat, right here, right now. Walking meditation teaches us that awakening isn't a distant goal or some future achievement. It's the sacred art of being present one step at a time. Each mindful step is both the journey and the destination. There's freedom in this realization. No longer do we chase perfection or escape from ourselves. Instead, we come home, to the body, to the breath, to the world as it unfolds around us. And in this homecoming, we find peace, not as a fleeting visitor, but as a steady companion. So as you carry this practice forward, remember, you don't need to wait for the perfect moment to begin. You don't need to carve out hours or retreat to distant places. All you need is the willingness to step fully into the present wherever you are. And every time you choose to walk mindfully, you affirm this truth, that your life is worthy of your full attention, that even the simplest steps can lead to profound transformation. If this journey has touched you, if it sparked a light of curiosity or calm in your heart, I invite you to share it. Comment below and tell me, what's your experience with walking meditation? Have you noticed how it shifts your day? Or maybe you're just starting out, what questions do you have? Your stories and questions don't just help this community grow, they inspire others to take their own first step. And if you found value here, please consider liking this video and subscribing. Together, we can create a space where mindful living thrives one step at a time. Thank you for walking this path with me. May your steps be gentle, your breath steady, and your heart open. Until next time, keep walking fully present, fully alive.